Okay, I forget what Ozzy number we're on, but this particular video is not only an update, but I'm going to put it in the Horse Geeks classroom playlist as a lesson because you, the owner, asked a little bit about him dragging his toes, and I had a comment on YouTube about the toe dragging, especially when Ozzy is under saddle. So I wanted to take a minute to explain that because it's not a painful condition, but what it's showing us is the lack of flexion that Ozzy has through his hind legs. On the x-rays, his gnarly arthritis is on the inside of both hocks. And it's big enough. When I had been putting the clay on it was because it got some like fill or liquid buildup, which means that they're under stress a little bit. He hasn't had as much swelling, and so I've stopped with the clay, but I continue to polo wrap. So when Ozzy started, like at the pre-purchase exam, he had what's called a swinging leg lameness, which means that his hind legs traveled through the midline and then landed. They didn't just flex and extend on a straight path of travel. He was doing that to protect any discomfort in the hocks because of the arthritis. But what it's showing us is the arthritis in the hocks was also developed because his hind leg kinematics were not correct. When the back is down and the pelvis is rotated backwards and the pushing phase of the leg, which is back here, is greater than the braking phase of the hind leg, which is here, then the leg is more often in extension, which means a straightening of the joints, versus when it lands and they resist their own body weight, they have to flex the hip joint, the stifle, the hock, and the fetlock. If it's not comfortable or easy for him to flex through the hip joint, stifle, especially, and the hock, then it puts more force on the leg when it's in this extended phase compared to the flexion phase. What can happen is then the fetlock, the bottom joint of the leg, can have excessive flexion because all of that need for flexion in the normal phase of every stride. If the hock is the one taking, the fetlock, which is the bottom joint here on the hind legs, which is why I polo wrap with fetlock support. If that fetlock is flexing too much because the hock and the stifle and the hip are not flexing enough, then you can get a secondary problem with suspensory injuries, suspensory strains, tears, that kind of thing, because the excess flexion of the fetlock is going to start pulling too much on that suspensory apparatus. So polo wrapping the hind legs with the fetlock sling of support is supposed to reduce the amount of flexion through the fetlock and encourage more flexion through the hock and the stifle and the hip joint. So he has these gnarly bumps of arthritis on the inside of both hocks. He's no longer got excess fluid buildup. So that tells me that he's not in pain. It's just not easy for him to flex through the fetlock. So in the pre-purchase exam, the way he moved the hind legs was like this, right? So that he didn't have to bend them. As we've been restoring the function of the hind legs, right, the toe dragging is basically showing us that it's still hard for him to pick up the leg. So each phase of every hind leg stride should push. At the end of the push, the leg joints should flex, then extend, then land, then flex in a resistance, which is the braking phase, peak vertical, and then push. We do the same thing when we walk, right? One leg is pushing while the other leg is braking. So when we see the toe dragging, it's two parts of every stride. When he pushes off with the hind leg, he's not flexing the joints enough to pick up the hoof and land on the ground. So instead of flexing the leg joints, you see the toe dragging like this. Then the hoof lands, and again, he doesn't have a lot of flexion in the braking phase of the stride. So when he pushes, the push is not very powerful or very big. That's why he's very slow, and we see the toe dragging, right? So let me get started with him. And this week, what we did, I had some time constraints, and so I decided to look at and show you that when I do the long reins on the small circles at the walk, it's specifically for the reason that the long reins are helping reduce the rotation or the rolling of the back and the pelvis while the horse is on the circle. So that takes away, it resists his ability to swing the leg out or swing the leg in without bending it, which is why we didn't see the toe dragging before. But as his back and hindquarters are remaining more level, it's creating a straight forward and straight back movement of the leg. That's where we start to see the toe dragging. Also, with my weight on him under saddle, there's more toe dragging. It's exaggerated, which just tells you that with the additional weight of the rider doing almost the same exercise, trying to restore the proper kinematics of the hind legs, we see an exaggerated toe dragging because in order to balance and use the hindquarters the same way on the ground that he would use with my weight on his back, he has to flex even more. So when I do the long reins on a small circle at the walk, there's some toe dragging, but it's a lot less than when there is weight on his back. So this week, what I decided to do, because of time constraints, was we kind of went on a program, and because the right hind was actually the less functional of the two hind legs, we worked to the right first, trying to restore that flexion, restore the function, which is related to all the way up to the hip joint, the use of the sacrum, the rotation of the pelvic bone forward and back, and related to the spine going down or up, right? So of course he struggles with this. The way I know it's not a painful issue is, number one, his hocks were injected in August. It's now November. So that should have alleviated pain from the arthritis. He's on daily Equiox, which is also an NSAID that's going to minimize any discomfort in this process of change. But if he were truly in pain, if I were asking for too much flexion, then his behavior would start to tell me I'm asking too much. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is he's either going to really refuse to move forward instead of just moving slow, or he's going to start fighting me, going too fast, becoming anxious, or refusing to move forward and becoming more tense. So when I do the long reins on this smaller circle, what we did this week was 45 minutes each way, because I can't force the legs to flex more. The way I'm restoring the flexion of all the hind leg joints is by how he's using his back and hindquarters. So the long reins are helping to resist the lateral side-to-side rolling of the back and hindquarter. And then this small circle, the shape itself, is encouraging the inside hind to step closer to the center of his torso or engage more in the braking phase. And it's a time and practice deal, just like physical therapy. What horses don't understand, that humans can understand in physical therapy, is if I force more flexion and actually create pain or go through a certain personal threshold that he has of discomfort in the process of change, then he's going to compensate rather than restore the correct function, he'll just find another way to protect himself. So the level of discomfort, which is not pain, but it means it's not easy for him, that's this size circle is where I find he can manage. And you'll see sometimes, oh, we gotta have our poop. Sometimes he picks up the foot and doesn't drag the toe. Sometimes he drags the toe a little when there is no weight on his back. So what that shows me is with weight on his back, requiring more flexion, more extension through the joints, I get more toe dragging because that's difficult for him. Oh, somehow the camera's not following. There it goes. Is the camera following? Okay, there we go. Okay, hopefully that didn't mess it up too much. So if we watch the toes on the hind hooves, right, there he drags the left, he drags the right a little. So what that means is the lateral dissipation in the leg kinematics, the outside or inside swing of the leg, is being resisted through the long reins. So that's restoring a straightforward, straight back movement of the leg. But if the hip, the stifle, and the hock don't easily flex, if they're not comfortable in the bending phase needed for every stride, then we're going to see toe dragging. So giving him more time with less stress is the easiest way. It's the path of least resistance to restoring the function of the hind legs. So he got 45 minutes each way this way at the walk on the long reins this week to give him a chance to get even more comfortable with the changes that he's making through his back, his pelvis, and the use of the hind legs during every stride. What tells me it's appropriate for him is I see the physical struggle. I see the toe dragging. I see sort of his mouth gets busy, or he loses his balance once in a while in a more obvious way, or he goes really, really slow and carefully. All of that tells me he's physically struggling to restore that function to the whole hindquarter and the back, including the flexion and extension of the leg joints. What tells me it's not painful is his ears are half out, he's concentrating, his energy is very calm, and I'm not having to push him just to maintain forward motion. He's choosing to stay at the walk. He's physically struggling, but mentally and emotionally, he's not escalating the energy or showing more signs of defensiveness. So that tells me I'm at a reasonable and appropriate level of physical challenge for his body. When I ride him, the more he loses forward, the more leg aids I have to use, or the more he fights me to have the steering, or if he starts to get distracted and anxious under saddle. All of those are signs that the physical challenge could be hitting a threshold where he's not feeling entirely safe going through this change, which means he won't change his body. He will protect what he knows. So that's how I'm always monitoring if the challenge I'm asking the horse to work through is appropriate for this horse today. So tomorrow I'll do another riding video to show you where he's at. But this work on the small circle without weight on his back is where I see he's able to actually lift the hoof and place it. So there, if we just watch his inside hind leg, hopefully it's on the camera, there he pushes, there he breaks, there he pushes and then breaks and then pushes, right? So when the hind hoof lands, it's supposed to flex or bend in order to resist his own body weight from falling forward. That's the braking phase of the leg. Then as the joints straighten and the hoof pushes backwards, that's the pushing phase of the stride. At the very end of the pushing phase, the leg should bend and swing forward, then straighten and land, and then bend again in the braking, straighten and push in the pushing phase. So those two phases of every single stride where the hind leg joints should bend, they don't bend very well. That's exactly what we're working on. It's exactly why he goes as slow as he does, is the restoration of that flexion function in the hip, the stifle, and the hock is kind of a slow process where stride after stride after stride, the phases of the stride themselves will encourage more and more bending of the joints. I don't need to put him over ground poles. I don't need to send him up and down hills. I specifically don't use ground poles because the humans love ground poles because we see the hind legs bend. But if he can barely bend the hind legs without the ground pole, then it might make me happier to see the legs bend, but it's probably at the expense of the stability and the engagement of his hindquarters and his back. So we don't easily see the back roll. We don't easily see the hindquarters tilt. So everybody frickin' recommends ground poles because we like to see the legs bend. But if the legs can't bend with the pelvis level and the back level, which is what I'm doing through the long reins, then trying to exaggerate that over a ground pole is either going to be too painful for him, or I'll see the joints bend at the expense of what I don't see happening through the use of the pelvis and the spine. So the toe dragging, you can see sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. Every once in a while he flexes the joints, particularly on the inside hind, well enough that the toe doesn't drag and the foot is picked up and placed closer to the center of the body, right? All of this pushing on the bit, this is all the same stuff I get under saddle, right? Pushing on the bit, falling forward when he lengthens the neck, really slowing down the speed and having to be very mindful of how he uses his back and hindquarter while he's restoring the functions of flexion and extension through the joints of the hind leg is difficult for him, right? With weight on his back, the toes drag more. So if I want to change that faster, then the fastest way to do it is give him more time without the weight on his back, where stride after stride, it requires less flexion of the joints to pick up the toes, right? And that little sort of give, that misstep you just saw, can be all of a sudden the joints start to become more mobile. So sometimes you'll get a clunk through the shoulders, sometimes you'll get kind of a dropping out of one hind leg for a second. None of it is painful, but none of it is entirely comfortable for him. When it is comfortable for him, we won't see the toe dragging, and we'll see him offer a little more energy in the forward motion. As long as this is a work in progress, we're going to see some toe dragging. We're not going to see a lot of flexion through the hind legs as the hoof picks up and lands forward. And then at the end of the pushing phase, when the hoof comes off the ground behind his body, again, if he doesn't flex the hip, the stifle, and the hock enough, then as he brings the leg forward, we'll see the toe being dragged along in the dirt, right? So this was the leg where the flexion was even more restricted than the other hind leg, but he drags his toes both ways for now, and that's just part of the process, right? So it's not painful. It is ugly. I mean, it's not pretty to look at, but it's a work in progress as we're starting to restore a full range of motion, right? So when a horse is disengaged, their leg is more often, the joints are more often stuck in extension, and the flexion becomes very difficult and can be uncomfortable to restore it, but not painful. So physical therapy for humans, we can kind of go through the pain when we're in physical therapy, restoring the healthy range of motion or full range of motion of the joint that we just replaced or had surgery on. But horses can't understand how to go through pain to get to something better. So it's more of a time game, kind of seeing where can I start to get the changes without creating so much discomfort that the horse starts to feel defensive. So mentally and emotionally, Ozzy is concentrating, he's calm, he's not fighting me to go forward, but the slowness of it and the fussiness and the toe dragging all tell me this is a level of difficulty for him that we're going to get some change without creating more problems in the process. So then it's just step after step after step after step. And if I used a device, like there's devices where you rubber band or elastic band the hind legs, or you put the horse in a frame using strings and pulleys and whatever, or use ground pulls so that the human eye can see more flexion. All of those make us feel better, but doesn't actually restore correct function, because the correct kinematics of the legs is always reflective of the use of the back and the axial skeleton and the pelvis. So the long reins are really addressing a resistance to any side-to-side rolling of the pelvis and the back. The circle, especially a small one, is encouraging more forward placement of the hind legs as we go round and round. But then it's completely up to Ozzy to figure out within those parameters, how do I get comfortable? How do I reorganize myself in order to find more comfort in motion? Good balance and healthy mechanics are always more comfortable than poor mechanics, bad or abnormal leg kinematics, or compensation patterns that are not working with the design of the body. Now, the process of getting from his habit to more and more correct function is kind of like this. It's slow, it's careful, it's a bit tedious maybe for us, but very difficult for the horse, right? But if he just seeks comfort in motion, he figures out, given enough time and practice, how to restore the function of those joints. Even with the arthritis, we can regain more mobility through those hocks, right? And the stifle and the hip don't have issues, but they haven't been flexing properly for a long time. If we let that go on, the brunt of the flexion phase in every stride is going to come out through the fetlock, through the bottom joint of the bottom leg joint. And I'm just going to change direction. We're going to look at a little bit the other way. But giving him an hour and a half workout this week, giving him 45 minutes each way, he really started to make more changes, get more comfortable with the flexion of those joints, and drag his toe a little less and a little less, right? But you can see it's still a work in progress. And that's why it just takes time. I can't force the body into more flexion, because all that would create is a pain issue that would then make him protect his body from my guidance, rather than following the guidance and figuring out slowly how to restore the proper use of the leg joints. Right? So as we go left, like you'll see, there's less toe dragging if I'm not on him. And so if I want him to really get comfortable fast, then I don't need to tax him with the challenge of weight on his back. If this is where I see he's starting to figure out how to reuse or how to restore the use of his hind legs, and I get better strides without weight on his back, then the groundwork is going to advance the training faster than the riding, because it's all about restoring the ideal mechanical functions to the body, starting with the spine and the pelvis, but more observable through the function of the legs and the use of the neck and head. So you can see he's finally starting to keep his neck much longer in this exercise. I was pretty happy where we got to with the trot on the long reins, and I was even able to make the circle a little bit smaller at trot. But this coordination at the walk really tells you what his strongest habits of movement are. And so the toe dragging at the walk sort of says his strongest habit in his body is just to sort of drag his hind legs behind, rather than really using them as part of the pushing and braking mechanism, right? And at this speed is where we start to equalize the braking function of the stride and the pushing function of the stride. It's pretty darn slow because the flexion has not been easy for him. And it's actually the cause of the arthritis in his hocks, right? The cause of the arthritis is that the leg was too long in the flexion phase and not balanced, too long in the extension phase of pushing, which is here, and not balanced enough with the flexion phase of bringing the leg forward and flexing to resist his own body weight. So that's what can cause the arthritis in the hocks. And instead of flexing the leg joints, he was just swinging that extended leg forward. Yeah, and this left hind leg is a little bit wobbly for him. So like I said, you'll still see toe dragging for a while. This is going to be a work in progress, but it's not nearly as pronounced when he doesn't have weight on his back on the same exercise compared to weight on his back. It's not a pain issue, but it does show he's struggling. So I just need to keep the comfort level at challenging, but not painful. And that's how he can go through his unique process of restoring the function to those joints and balancing out the two phases of every stride. So I think that's all I wanted to show you for today. And this is what we did a lot of this week, just giving him time to find more comfort. And the reason I went 45 minutes each way is because it takes a while. It's not going to exhaust him to do an hour and a half at the walk, especially without weight on his back. But it took him that long to sort of explore, experiment, make a million mistakes, and then find an improvement. Now, he still will stop like he's doing now, but he's not really resisting. He's not getting tense about it. It's like he's thinking his way through it. So he's not resisting my aid to go forward again, which tells me he's pretty comfortable doing it, but it's hard. It's very hard. So this is the process of rehab, has to be slow and thoughtful. The coordination he shows me at the walk is really the coordination I'm getting in the trot and the canter. But in trot and in canter, he can look better. It doesn't look so hard for him because the body works in a little different way at trot, and again, another little different way at canter. So if a horse is struggling in the walk, I have sort of a primary coordination that I need to change. And his trot, what I was most concerned about with the long rein work on the trot was just that he wasn't rushing and stopping or having a meltdown or getting defensive. So his trot got pretty rhythmic, pretty good on the big circles, and I can leave that for now. But I really need to improve the coordination at the walk to be able to change the deeper habit of movement that you don't see necessarily, because his trot looks much better than his walk. But the struggle he has at the walk tells me he's masking a little bit at the trot what should be very correct function. And it's also easier for him at trot because the body works in a different way. It doesn't take as much control. So I'm still going to work on the trot, but not as much. I focused on this week for longer periods of time, giving him a chance to work through issues, find a change, and stabilize the change. And then tomorrow I'll show you how he's doing under saddle. Right? And how he's doing under saddle is maybe visibly hasn't changed a lot from the last video, but I'll just show you where we're at for the beginning of the ride tomorrow. And today I'm just going to do another day of the long reins, but I'm pretty pleased. The longer he goes, the better he gets at it, and the less toe dragging I see, which means he's starting to flex those hind leg joints more and more. I don't need to visibly see the increase of flexion. It's the lack of toe dragging that tells me he's getting it. And I don't need to force the legs over a ground pole or with a device into seeing them bend more. Because if I do that, it might be at the expense of the function of the spine or the stability of the pelvis. But that's what people often want to see because it makes us feel better. But when we have correct movement, it's subtle, and it's subtle how it goes through the changes. So I'm going to continue working him, but I think that's all I'm going to video for now as an update. Oops. There we go.